Hello, my friends. Welcome to Origins. My name's Don Chapman. It's my privilege to be your host. You know, Origins is a forum where we take the evidence of science and we use it to validate the truth of creation. We have a great guest with us today. We're truly honored to have Dr. Don DeYoung with us. Now, today we're going to talk about discovery by design. Tell me what that means.
Well, we're all aware of design in nature, and I think it's time to take it to a new level.
Okay.
What we're finding out is that God has placed countless ideas in nature waiting for us to discover and put to practical use. Actually, there's a word, mimicry, that's very popular in the biology world. The idea of one organism copying another one for protection, for instance. It's a word that goes way back in biology. One of the classic examples is a creature called the owl butterfly. Now, it's a small creature, but with this large spot on its wing, it looks like a big eye, and that's enough to scare off the birds for its protection, to keep it safe.
So there are birds that think that's actually an owl's eye.
Well, it looks a little bit forbidding.
Yes, it does.
Now, that's one of the older ideas of mimicry. But this word today has been changed somewhat, and a prefix has been added, the word bio. So now we have this word biomimicry, which describes this idea of going to nature and mimicking nature to come up with new inventions and new practical ideas for today. And we do have some examples that we brought along, okay, and we can run through these.
Please go up to the screen and show us those examples.
Diatoms are a good example to start with. Now, what is a diatom? Well, they're small. Smaller is let's say, a grain of sand. And they're plants or animals or something in between. They're tiny and they live everywhere. They're in the soil, they're in the water, they're even in the air. And what can something so small be of use and interest to us today? Well, it turns out that these diatoms have interesting shapes. Actually, they grow a shell around themselves made of silica, and some of these look like filters, like this one, and some look like gears. They come in all shapes and sizes. Some even look like chandeliers. Now, where this comes into play is a word that's very popular today, nanotechnology. What's happening today is that engineers are building very small things, nano level, pumps, gears, motors of all types, again, as small as a grain of dust. Well, these small things need even smaller components. Along comes these diatoms, which are just the kind of shape of the things that we need. They can take these diatoms and coat them with a metal film to make them more permanent. And then with those small objects they end up with, they do become gears for motors or sieves or strainers.
They actually just take the existing diatom and coat it. They don't make a similar product to it. They actually coat it and use it as a gear.
Yes, the shell itself is rather fragile, but you can make it permanent with a metal coat. So here we have these components for this modern idea of motors on a small scale. It was there all the time, and then suddenly we can make good use of it.
That's incredible.
There are many different kinds of diatoms, and that work goes on to explore them. A good example of design in nature. Now, some would say that these things have slowly improved or evolved over time, but we find these in the fossils. They've always been around with their intricate shapes, which become of use to us in our own day. Another example, let's go to the insect world. Okay. Now, these small little creatures, in fact, here we have a water strider, one of these bugs that can skate across the water. We've all seen these things. How can they float on water? Well, it turns out if you look closely at their legs, there are tiny hair follicles. In fact, those follicles have even smaller hairs, and little air pockets get caught in between them so that they can float and they get around. But even more interesting, Don, are the fact that insects, they come with legs these days. And as we're trying to build things in our day, you get into this world of robotics, whether it's going to be some kind of instrument to clean up toxic waste, or do electronics, or even something to explore the moon. And we often use wheels when we're building these small things. But nature, the creator, is kind of giving us a hint that perhaps another approach would be to use legs for robotics. Now, this is kind of a cute one that we have in the picture here, this guy here, but he's got these little legs instead of wheels, and it's a good way to get around. In fact, they're actually building some new small robotics that can walk on water like that water strider does for water testing and monitoring in that way.
And you're saying to us that scientists when they need to invent something to do that, would actually look at the insect and kind of copy it as they make something man-made.
Exactly. It was there all the time, just waiting for us to make use of. Let me give you a real good example of this. Mars has been of a special interest in space exploration. A planet half the size of the Earth, mostly a desert, but lots of probes have been sent there. In fact, we have a picture here of a probe called Spirit. It's about the size of a golf cart. In fact, it's been up there for several years, and they make this thing with wheels so that it can roll around on the surface of Mars to see what it can find. You know, they're looking for Martians or whatever, and they don't find that, but there are interesting things on Mars. Well, catch the difference again between that water strider, or most insects with legs, and then this robotic craft here with wheels. These wheels are stuck in the desert of Mars, and they've been that way for several months. And in fact, they rock this back and forth to try to get it unstuck, and it keeps going deeper and deeper. It's not going to get out of there. It's going to be there forever, I think. And so it gives us the idea, maybe we've gone about the wrong way building this creature, this craft. Perhaps we should make legs on it. And that's what the new generation of spacecraft have, so that it can kind of walk across the sand or over rocks and not get stuck. In fact, if one of these space robotics happens to tip over, they can just kind of tip the legs up the other way and it can keep on walking. We have a lot to learn even from the insect world on how to take care of things.
So the new models will be a lot more like the water spider and less like your car.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Learning space exploration by studying insects from nature that were there all the time. And this is what I mean by design in nature. It's fascinating, and the countless ideas go on. And let's go on ourselves with another one. This story goes back 100 years. There was a fellow who lived out on the East Coast. His name was Sperry. And in the summertime, he liked to go sailing. Now, again, this is the early 1900s, and he had a sailboat. And back then, the problem was the deck of the boat gets slippery, and you can fall and hurt yourself.
Sure can.
And that's the way it was. And they just put up with that.
Yeah.
Well, one winter day, this Sperry was out walking his dog, a Cocker Spaniel, in the snow and the ice. And even though the dog owner was slipping on the ice, he noticed that his dog was sure-footed and had no problems walking on an icy sidewalk. Well, when they got back home, Sperry looked at the paw of his dog closely, and if you look at it, there's little lines or grooves in the paw print of the dog. Sperry got a piece of rubber membrane, carved some grooves in it, taped it to the bottom of his shoe, went outside, and the instant traction showed up. Up till that time, shoes had flat bottoms, and he realized with a zigzag pattern, not only can it deform, but it kind of shoots the water off to the side and makes you much more sure-footed. Well, he went to work and made a shoe. Actually, the Sperry Topsider is still being sold today as a sailor shoe. And he also gave this idea to the military. In fact, athletic shoes and many of our shoes have these grooves or a herringbone pattern today. And it all goes back to this discovery that Sperry made by looking at the paw of a Cocker Spaniel.
That's amazing. Now, I've seen Sperry shoes. It's still a brand today. And I have deck shoes that are made by Sperry, but I didn't know the story that went with them. That's incredible.
It is. It's a popular brand today, and a form of shoe that we all have, going back to a dog's paw, further going back to the creation week when God designed these things, I believe within mind for the idea for us to study these and come up with practical ideas. So we're looking at a number of designs from nature and useful applications of them. Here's the next one. Going in the water. Now there's a boxfish, maybe 6 inches or a foot long, a very awkward looking fish. It looks silly. It looks awkward in the water. Well, this story begins actually over in Germany a few years ago. In a group of auto manufacturers. They got together and trying to decide how to make the next generation of cars that will be efficient and be able to go through the air, with a streamlined motion. And help their car design, this group went to an aquarium. Now, this was a large building where you could see the sea life that had been put on display. They wanted to go there to watch the sharks because they're well designed and they can slip through the water. And while they were in this aquarium, one of the fellows got to looking at the corner of the aquarium where there was this boxfish moving around. And he looked at it and pointed, and they laughed and they said, "Who would design something like that, a box underwater?" But they kind of took the measurements and took them back to the laboratory and did some studies. In fact, they built sort of a wind tunnel where they had this shape and they could blow air around it. And what they discovered is that this creature is well designed. For its kind of motion underwater, there are ocean currents and seaweed and coral, and this thing slips around very well. And so they took this design and applied it to cars, and well, they're coming up with some interesting new automobiles.
Yeah.
Actually, this is called Bionic Mercedes, and it's a little compact car. It's very small, with kind of a flat front end, modeled somewhat on the boxfish.
I'll be darned.
It turns out that this car can get 55 miles per gallon.
Yeah.
It's very streamlined. And how are they learning to build this new generation of cars? By studying a boxfish that at first seemed kind of comical, but it is well designed. God doesn't make mistakes when He makes creatures like boxfish, and we have much to learn from them.
That's amazing.
I think that most of these ideas have never been found. They're still out there in nature, just waiting for us to find and to put to good use. While we're in the water, let me mention another one. Now, a lobster. Interesting creature. Is there anything we can learn from that? Can we come up with a practical idea? Well, we can. These live in relatively shallow water, so there's light that filters down, and so they have an eye they can see. In fact, I can catch the one right here and on the other side as well. Their eyes are not like our eyes. They don't have a lens such as we do. Instead, if you look closely at the eye of a lobster, it's actually it's like a box. It's like a rectangular box which is open, and light can go down through this box. And not only that, but the inside surfaces of this box are mirror. They're silvered, they're shiny. So what happens when light goes in this box, it kind of ricochets off both sides and zigzags down through this opening, and finally till it hits the sensor so that the lobster can see. It's a very different type of optics than what we have today, but it's of interest. To the space age. Now, stars give off many more kinds of light than we can see. There's more light than meets the eye. There's not only visible light, but there's gamma rays, there's infrared light, and there's X-rays that stars give off. And if we can measure those X-rays, we can learn a lot more about creation, about space. It turns out that this kind of rectangular box with silvered sides is just what's needed to focus X-rays. Here's a microscope picture of the eye of the lobster showing these rectangles, these openings. Actually, there's multiple ones, and the light goes on through and hits their retina so they can see. And what's been invented on this basis is what's called a lobster eye telescope. Actually, this is part of the space station where they have one on board because they want to detect X-rays, and so they have one up there functioning.
Do they really call it that, the lobster eye?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a cutting-edge instrument based on the eye of a lobster.
Amazing.
And who knows what else there is still to learn from a lobster that we haven't even considered yet. Designs from nature. They're just interesting and showing just the practicality of creation, the way that God's put it all together. Another example. Now this is springtime, at least in the Midwest, when the leaves pop out. There's one particular tree called a beech tree.
Yes, sir.
And in the spring, as the leaves are growing, they become fully formed, and they're all locked in a little pod. And on one spring day, when things are right, the pod opens up and the whole leaf forms. And as you recall from looking at a picture of leaf, there's interesting lines the way it was folded up in the first place. In fact, I have a little model here of kind of how this works. Large size beech leaf here. This is when the leaf is in the pod, and then one day it opens up and bang, you have the whole leaf suddenly showing up, ready to go like this.
So they burst out in one day.
It's an interesting folding mechanism, kind of like an accordion. Yes. Well, there's a whole art to folding, and some butterfly wings have different ways to fold up this way, but this has been studied. In fact, it's another way to solve a practical problem. And if I could just go back to the space age one more time. With satellites, we need to have solar collectors for their energy. And they got to have quite a bit of area. But to get them up into space, you got to fold them all up to get them inside the space shuttle, or however they're getting up there, to refold this thing. And then when we get in space, you want them to pop open again. And actually, they're using this shape from a beech leaf for some of the solar collectors. We have one example right on the screen here of a close-up picture here. Using this leaf that's always been around, at least since the creation week, to help us learn folding. And they're also doing something else with this. Remember, Don, what highway maps are like when you unfold them and you can never fold them up again?
I do.
Well, this is the new generation of highway maps, so that you can pull them apart and put them back together instantly. Even with GPS, some of us still need maps like this. And so that's another practical application. These ideas are countless.
So the space station has lobster eyes and beech leaf folders. That's amazing how that works. Dr. DeYoung, we've got to take a break. We'll be back in a moment. Don't you go away, because we have some other great examples about how God's design can help us invent things that we need today. We'll be right back with you.
Today's guest on Origins, Dr. Don DeYoung, has a PhD in physics and is chairman of the Science and Mathematics Department at Grace College in Indiana, where he has been on staff since 1972. He is also president of the Creation Research Society and an author of many books, which are available at the website www.creationresearch.org. Dr. DeYoung can be reached at Grace College, 200 Seminary Drive, Winona Lake, Indiana, 46590. Dr. DeYoung speaks on creation topics and believes that the details of nature are a powerful testimony to the Creator's care for mankind.
We're back with Dr. Don DeYoung, and we're talking about discovery by design. What a fascinating concept, that many times what we call inventions are really just copying or mimicking design that God has already built into nature, and that by studying nature we can learn how to design things that we need today. Is that a fair summary of where we are?
That's good, Don. That's what we're at.
And you gave me some tremendous examples, but you have a couple more for us.
You know, this is a day of security. Fingerprints, passwords, everything to keep track of us. Well, the Lord has given us one feature that's even more distinct than fingerprints.
Wow.
And that turns out to be our eye. Now, as we call our eye, you get the center pupil, and then around the outside edge you have what's called the iris. And if you look at it close, there's even a lot of little star-like points that show out in all directions.
Mm-hmm. It's not a solid color. There's a lot of things in there.
Yes, and there's no two alike.
Okay.
And there are a lot more variables there than there are even with fingerprints. And so in today's world of security, it's realizing that eye identification is a good way to keep track of us. And eye recognition is starting to show up for security in airports and in some businesses as well. Again, it's an area that's been there all the time, and finally we're making use of. And even though you might be able to do something with a fingerprint by scarring it or whatever, you can't touch the eye. And so that becomes kind of a fail-safe way to identify.
This machine is actually doing that. It actually has a camera that reads your eye and identifies that with you.
In some airports, they're going this way, and it's there,
and I
think it's helpful in this day that we live in.
Wow.
There are lots of interesting examples from the human body. In fact, let me mention another one here. We have a bone in our human body between our knee and our hip. Here, I brought one along just to look at for a minute here. This is the largest bone in our body. It's called the femur. And when this was first looked at, when anatomists long ago, some might have thought, well, now that's a poor design, especially this ball and socket at the top that fits into your hip, because it's off to the side, it's off center. Seems like it should be straight up and down. Won't that break off? Isn't that kind of a poor design? Well, it's not a poor design, as we find out in our modern day. There's all kinds of structure inside this bone to strengthen that and make it secure. Back in the late 1800s, an architect was trying to design a new building. In fact, there was a World's Fair that was going to take place in Paris. And there was a competition for who could build a building for the times. And this architect had a friend who was in the medical world, and he was showing him this bone. And the architect took this bone and he did the mathematics of this curve at the top, and then he kind of inverted the whole thing and came up with this interesting arch-type curve here. And he thought, maybe I can build something on that style. By the way, his name was Gustav Eiffel. So that brings to mind what we're talking about here, the Eiffel Tower, and that's the building that he came up with. And if you remember the bottom curved braces, it's the very same shape. In fact, he used the same metal structure that the bone has with its structure inside.
So one of the most famous architectural design buildings in the world, structures in the world, is the Eiffel Tower, and you're telling me that Mr. Eiffel, Dr. Eiffel, used the femur out of a human body as the model from which he built that.
And not only that, but when he built this tower, his competitors laughed at him and said it's not an attractive building, it'll probably fall down on its own. Well, it's the last building standing. It's a famous landmark, and there it is, a testimony to the design of our femur, which he worked with, the mathematics, to come up with that. Even architect ideas from nature. Wow. Just to hit one or two more quick designs.
Absolutely.
It's sometimes said that these things evolve and they improve with time. How about an example from the non-living world?
Okay.
It doesn't mutate. It doesn't naturally select. It's been around since the creation. And one good example is something called a buckyball. Now, it's kind of a form of carbon, actually 60 atoms that come together, and it looks like a soccer ball. These are smaller than a grain of dust. They were only discovered a couple of decades ago, but they're around. They come down from space. They're in the soil of the earth. Can this be of any use? Well, yes. Back to the nano world, where we're making microscopic sized motors and pumps and valves. It turns out that these buckyballs are just what we need to be ball bearings for tiny motors.
Now, how do they harvest them? How do they get those?
Very fine touch.
Very carefully.
Under a microscope,
Okay.
Yes, with something even smaller than the tweezers,
Wow.
but it can be done. And by the way, these can also be used as carriers for medicine. You could put
and they're
droplets.
made out of graphite.
Well, made out of pure carbon.
Okay.
Graphite is another form of
All right.
carbon, and so is diamond.
Uh-huh.
So there's several forms, and this is a practical, fascinating one. And there's been in nature ever since Creation Week, and then in our own day we find out that this is very useful.
Isn't that amazing? Nanotechnology, that's a very important thing.
Here's one last example that's also kind of interesting. It involves a particular kind of a star called a pulsar, which is spinning, and it has a hot spot on it. And every time it spins around, it gives us a flash of light. It's like on and off. It's a star that winks at you. And some of them are very rapid, like 100 times a second or 1,000 times a second. These stars are turning that rapidly. Huh. And they're so precise and so accurate. What we're finding out is that these pulsars are a time standard, even more accurate than atomic clocks.
Wow.
And so here's another good application in nature of something, a way to keep track of time for computers or machinery or whatever, and we're making good use of it.
You know, there's a huge debate today about intelligent design. When you step back from the argument and just look at the incredible design of all of these things, you've given us 10 examples, it would be very hard to say there's no designer once I've looked at all that.
Exactly. Even in a world that's no longer perfect, we can see this intelligent design. And not only that, but it's useful. God planned this for us to make use of, to live on this earth.
It seems to me that science is almost at conflict with each other. At one moment, we are looking at nature to find new discoveries for design, and at the other side of the scale, we're saying, but there's no design. How do we reconcile that?
Well, we don't have to, because we know there's a designer there, and I think it's so refreshing to give good recognition to the Lord who made all of these examples in the first place.
Friends, I think that I don't need to say anything else at the end of this show as we looked at the incredible value of God's design, even in our modern technology. You just remember, as you prepare to join us again next time, that it's God's view He created you. And that should be your worldview too, my friend. God bless you. We hope to see you again soon here on Origins.
Thank you for watching this edition of Origins. To get a copy of the information presented today, you can download a PDF file of program number 1105 from our website at www.originstv.org. Or for a DVD of this series, send a $12 donation to cover shipping and handling and write to Origins, program number 1105, Cornerstone Television, Wall, Pennsylvania 15148.
Origins is made possible by the faithful prayers and the financial support of you, our Cornerstone Television family.